All right. Good morning, Doug. Today we want to talk about Russia, but we really want to talk about Russia through the lens of the U.S. establishment, and a good basis for that, or a good window into that, is looking at this recent Bloomberg article that you sent me earlier today.
Yes, I I really don't know who the author is, but it's obvious as he presents his, or as Bloomberg presents his credentials at the beginning of it, that he's a denizen of the Washington Beltway. I mean, he's a Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. That sounds very prestigious. And he's a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, which is kind of a mealy-mouthed, more or less right-wing think tank in Washington, where people that toe the party
It's
line go to
it's a
collect a
big
stipend.
chamber of commerce like organization, right? Like it's they're always on in support of what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm supposed to be impressed by all these things, I guess. And then he says he's the author of The Twilight Struggle, What the Cold War Teaches Us About Great Power Rivalry Today. You know, who's got time to go through blather from people like this? But what did you find out about this
Well,
guy?
it
What's his
looks
name again? Incidentally, it's
his
Hal
name is
Brands.
Hal Brands. Yeah, and it looks like he's actually written and published seven books since 2008, on his website. It looks like,
Hmm.
and he served as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for strategic planning from 2015 to 2016.
That must mean he's a warmonger, really.
Yep. Yeah, he also served as the lead writer for the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the United States and consulted with a range of government offices and agencies in the intelligence and national security communities.
So has he ever had a real job that you can tell from looking at his further bio?
No, no. I mean, maybe he worked at a fast food joint when he was a kid or something, but he neglected to add that to his bio.
Yes, and after doing some productive labor, maybe when he
Maybe.
was in school, he veered off to the dark side.
And
How old is he,
he's
would you say?
boy, he looks like he's like mid 40s, about
Okay.
my age. Yeah, he looks like he's about my age.
Okay. Well, he's got a great career ahead of him in Washington, D.C.
It appears
So,
so. Yes.
what,
So let me find this. Let me find this actual the Bloomberg article. Okay, so I've got the Bloomberg article on the screen now in front of us.
good. All right. So, what pops to mind? The very first sentence of what he's written is that it's Ukraine's fight for survival. Is Ukraine fighting for survival? I mean, the Ukrainian people have been in this nebulous area in in Asia for I don't know how long, 1,000 years anyway. So it's not fighting for survival. It's a what we've got going on here is a border war between two shithole countries, and
Well,
it's been blown up into out of all proportion. Quite frankly,
and
I
even
mean, it's
countries
not.
needs a little bit of drilling down, because it's not like all the people in the country are actually fighting. It's like these political regimes that are in charge of one compared to another. I mean, it's that's who's actually fighting here.
Yeah, exactly. It's not Ukraine that's fighting. It's the Russian regime fighting the Moscow regime fighting the Kiev regime. Quite frankly, I mean that's all it is. And people forget that the genesis of this war was when two Russian vast majority provinces of the Ukraine, and here's another thing: it used to be called the Ukraine only a decade ago, which means a borderland. That's what Ukraine means in the local language, borderland. It used to be called the Ukraine, and its borders have come and gone and become totally non-existent for over 1,000 years. But you're quite correct. It's not. Ukraine fighting for survival. It's the regime of Zelensky fighting for survival. And is Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is he even a good guy? I mean, I can't confirm this.
He was on the Grammys last night, Doug, so he must be.
I didn't see that. Oh, he must be.
Yeah.
He's got support from all the right people, obviously.
Yeah, clearly.
But, there are things floating around that he owns a $30 million house in Miami, and he's worth scores of millions of dollars.
A billion, Doug, a billion. He came out in the Panama Papers. He was one of the specific people listed there, and they had all of his assets. It was over $1 billion. Yeah.
Wow.
$1 billion.
So where did all that money come from? And what did an actor do to deserve that?
Yeah, I don't know.
And why doesn't anybody ever mention that this guy is as rich as any other East European oligarch?
It complicates the story, Doug. We're simple people. We need simple stories. Tell us who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, and then we'll know which flag to tote around.
I forget these things sometimes. You're so right. Okay, so the article starts out with a line of bullshit, phrasing it as the Ukraine's fight for survival. And what else to go through here? Next couple of paragraphs are stating the obvious. Russia isn't some tin pot tyranny like Cuba or North Korea. Okay, right. So he states the obvious. And then he goes on to say, in the next paragraph, the rebirth of democracy Russia experienced fleetingly in the 1990s. And as almost everywhere, there's this use of democracy as being a good thing. I mean, democracy is just a method of determining who's going to rule you. It's not rule of the people. It's a method of determining by voting who gets to rule you. I mean, it's a totally...
and it's arguably not a very effective way. I'm pretty sure Hitler was democratically elected. Lots of bad people end up being democratically elected.
Exactly. And I often define democracy as mob rule dressed up in a coat and tie, which is really what it is. And it's not democracy anyway. Democracy, the word was coined in ancient Athens and in 5th century Athens, and it's about it was a plebiscitary democracy in those days, where all of the citizens who had a right to participate, which was to say males, adult males, would get together and they would vote on things. It was a direct democracy. So that's not what we have today. We have, at best, we have republics today where elections determine the rulers, and then the rulers do what they want, but say they're expressing the will of the people. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, actually, Doug, let me frame this whole article as something real quick. In that this policy wonk essentially argues that there are three potential outcomes of from where we are today, as with Putin. So there's three potential outcomes. He narrows it down, and these are the three. And the first one, he says, is the rosiest scenario, the best case scenario, which he calls the Moscow Spring.
The Moscow Spring.
Yeah, and he says that's a go ahead. Sorry.
Now, what is the Moscow Spring in this policy? Well,
he says the Moscow Spring is which the costs of conflict lead to regime change and the rebirth of the democracy Russia experienced fleetingly in the 1990s. So essentially, that a group of people take out Putin, and then a rebirth is allowed to happen once he's out of the way.
Well, this guy may be a policy wonk, but he doesn't even recall very recent history because, look, I'm not a fan of any politician that I can think of. Well, possible exception of Ron Paul, obviously. or any world leader, certainly. Some are better than others. But what happened after Boris Yeltsin left the scene? Maybe that's what he's referring to. I don't know.
Yep.
And Putin took over. Well, actually, Putin was a very favorable influence back then. He doesn't mention that, but that's the only thing I think he can be referring to. Putin privatized the Russian economy. Wasn't done very well because a bunch of rich guys got most of the corporations, but still was better than the old Soviet economy. So step in the right direction. He reduced the income tax in Russia to 10%, among the lowest in the world. That was excellent. And he avoided the country having massive internal strife and civil wars, where all of the autonomous regions and autonomous republics, and there's all kinds of subdivisions within Russia itself. Forget about the ex-Soviet states. He avoided war and nasty civil war with all these things. So actually, Putin wasn't such a bad guy, at least then.
Right. Well, and I think, saying the most rosy scenario is that there's going to be a change of regime somehow that occurs there, and that, Russia under pressure from the outside world would essentially, just like South Africa experienced in the late 1980s, pressure from the outside world reformed itself in the eyes of the liberal community, the liberal world, and adopts the policies of the liberal order. I think that, again, that's the rosiest scenario, that something like that happened in his mind.
Well, and in his black little heart of hearts, I suspect that he's a fan of Lindsey Graham, certainly one of the worst people in the Senate, he'd actually like to see Putin taken out surreptitiously or any other way. That's my guess.
I think you're totally right. And actually, on that note, let me see if I can find something to share with you real quick that I just saw that you might find of interest. 1 second. Let me see if I can switch the screen to this really quick. Stop share. It's worth you seeing this, seeing what the big guys got to say about Putin as of right now. Here we go. Ready?
Yeah. I'm not getting any audio on my.
Oh, you're not? Okay. All right. Sorry. I didn't realize it wasn't going through. Anyway, what it is, sorry, I didn't realize it wasn't going. But he says that Putin is in fact a war criminal. He's not pulling any punches, that he needs to be treated as a war criminal, and that they need to collect all the facts and actually try him in the international court for being a war criminal. Now that's pretty aggressive. How does Putin ever, you kind of cutting off all diplomatic avenues with talk like that? That's for sure.
Well, it's really stupid. And it's also very hypocritical because, of course, saying something like this, I know that there are a lot of jingoists that are going to brand me as being anti-American. I'm actually very pro-American. I'm just anti-United States government at this point. When you talk about being a war criminal, how about, the US government has been responsible for, is it millions of deaths through war just since the end of World War II? Let's see.
Yes, 500,000 children in Iraq alone. We know that to be true based on Madeleine Albright's own assessment back in the 90s.
Well, we can go back further than that. We can start with the Korean War, which was responsible for the death of 50,000 US soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Koreans. Then we can go up to the Vietnam War, totally as unnecessary as the Korean War. Once again, 50,000 US deaths, 1 million or more Vietnamese deaths, all kinds of coups, and then Syria and Libya and Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, most of these were actually war crimes on the part of the U.S. But we're not allowed to even recognize that as being a fact. Forget about talk about it.
Yeah.
So no, Putin is actually much less of a war criminal than most of our recent presidents, quite frankly.
Right. Okay. So now this guy says that it's unlikely that the rosy scenario happens, though. He is unlikely that it happens, and then he articulates a couple of other positions. Or did you have anything else to say about his first potential outcome, or are you ready to go to the second one?
Well, he's a rather constipated thinker, quite frankly. For somebody that's in a think tank and is paid to do nothing but think all day, not like earn money or engage with the world, just think. He comes up with pretty pedestrian thoughts.
Yes.
Most of these guys are, but then he says, his last sentence, he says, against a more sluggish, stagnating Russia, the U.S. could fare well enough in a protracted rivalry. Well, I don't even understand what that means. Why should the US government have a protracted rivalry against a second-rate power? As I've said so often in the past, Russia's basically just a gas station with an attached gun store in the middle of a wheat field. I mean, with a declining population. I mean, why do we have to think in terms of a protracted rivalry against a third world country, albeit with some nuclear weapons? So it's anyway.
Yeah, it's silly, and it's not only that, but it's like well, I mean, this is true of all three of his options in my mind. Is that it's totally seems to be excluding the whole economic element here, which I think is critically important to understanding, what Russia's options are, the difficulty that Russia will face, and really, what's actually happening, with all the escalation right now. The escalation is not really happening as much on the kinetic front today. It seems to be basically at a kind of a steady pace here, but the acceleration on the legal front and the economic front seem to be massive. And I think, it certainly creates great risks to our economy. I mean, that's what they've announced of it. Just today in Germany, grocery store prices in all of the Aldi stores, which is the big grocer there, prices went up 30% for most items. So is that winning in the eyes of the West? Is this the protracted engagement that we will expect that we might have in his scenario? And who really loses in that scenario? Is it actually Putin, or is it the Germans in this case?
Well, it's certainly not the ruling class that loses at all. It's the average guy in the street. And right. These people don't understand anything about economics at all. They don't understand the way the world works in producing and consuming. I mean, but these are the people in charge of the world. One point that he makes down here is that he's afraid that there might be a fanning of militant nationalism in Russia, which would produce a Russian variant of fascism. Well, he doesn't define fascism. It's a term that is thrown around here as everywhere, but it's never defined. I mean, what is that supposed to be? Is that supposed to be jackboots and spiffy-looking uniforms?
I think so. If you don't have a high and tight haircut and you're not wearing polished jackboots, I think it's not fascism. I think that's how it works.
Yeah. But of course, the whole world has a variant of fascism today, which is basically, the word was really coined by Mussolini. And what the word means is a melding of the state with corporations, where the one becomes an arm of the other. So that's what we have everywhere in the world today. There are no real socialist states in the world today, with the possible exceptions of Cuba and North Korea. I think they're about the only ones left. There are no capitalist states in the world today. I mean, none of them exist. All the states in the world today are fascist states.
Right.
Where,
And I think, as an example to that, among all these, there was something like 800 and some corporations that left. Was it 800 something? Actually, I'm getting the number wrong. But there were many, many high profile corporations that just closed up shop and left Russia when all this happened. And they did it without the state demanding they do or forcing them to do. They just did it sort of on their own. They just decided, okay, this is a bad actor. Our state is against this state. So we're just going to turn against them ourselves. And so, penalizing your average Russian in doing it. And, so it's the melding of the state, and they don't even need orders from the state to know the wishes of the state, and they seem to act upon it.
No, it's corporate virtue signaling is what it is. And basically it's screwing the interests of their customers who are buying their products and screwing the interests of their shareholders, because it's going to be very costly for them to write off their investment there in Russia and write off the profits that presumably they were making in Russia. So it's all very stupid from start to finish.
Well, I like that after that, he talks about the nationalism, and he says, but when Putin eventually falls, of course, because I imagine he must fall in all of this, he says he will be replaced by an equally repressive, ambitious, and xenophobic leader. I mean, that's the whole problem with hoping he leaves at all, isn't it?
Well, it is. And how's that any different than what happens in the US or any other countries? I mean, after Clinton, we got rid of Clinton, so he was replaced with the baby Bush, and Bush was replaced with Obama, with Trump, and now maybe the worst of them all. It's hard to say because they're all bad in different ways. Now with Biden. So of course, Putin's going to be replaced by somebody else. I mean,
yeah.
But the next thing that I got here is that Russia becomes a superpower to Iran with, but correct me if I'm wrong, but people like this like to paint Iran as the bogeyman and the bad guy, and I'm no fan of the mullahs and the ayatollahs and all the rest of this type of thing. But as far as I can tell, Iran is basically leaving everybody else alone. They're destroying.
I'm reminded of the great Muhammad Ali, who said, actually, I can't say it in this way because it would be probably get us a strike. But you know what Muhammad Ali had to say about the Vietnamese who never did him any harm?
I remember that quote very well. I ain't got no beef against no Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me. And then we use a word that we're not supposed to. Well, I guess you can say.
Probably you can't, Doug. You can't say anything.
You can't say, this is disgusting.
It is.
It's a perfectly good historical word. We're not trying to insult anybody.
Hell no, we're complimenting the man who said it, in fact.
Exactly. And I'm a huge fan of Muhammad Ali. I always have been. And I think I always will be.
Yep.
With all his, sure, he's made plenty of mistakes, but I like Muhammad Ali, just like I was always a fan of Malcolm X, who, believe it or not, was actually a libertarian and was evolving rapidly towards becoming an overt libertarian. And they both use the so-called N-word a lot, as Black comedians do today. But here we are having a conversation between
two adults can't have a talk,
and we can't, and we're afraid to say
not afraid. We're not afraid. I just recognize the consequences. The consequences are we'll get a strike on our account, and then make it more, and then we'll, after a couple more of those, then we won't be able to publish anything.
Yeah, that's true. But actually, should we really care? Because we're not doing this for money. There's zero money.
There's zero money. Well, I think the thing is that if you're going to use it, you want to use it on something that might count. Like, we know it's a stupid rule, just like not talking about the presidential election last time, just in particular the last presidential election. You're not supposed to talk about that in any suspicious ways, or that will get you a strike. It's just, we should use it when it counts rather than use it on something trivial.
Well, frankly, I'm much more interested in replacing the Biden regime than the Putin regime, because the Putin regime does not create a danger to me personally, but the Biden regime definitely does. And I'm much more interested in actually in replacing the regime that's been foisted upon us subtly by Facebook and Google and Apple
Yes.
and Microsoft and the rest of them than I am in the Russian regime, because they're not going to, they propose about zero danger to any of us.
Similar to Iran in that way.
Similar to Iran, exactly right.
Yep. Yep. But yeah, you're right. Iran is one of those. Well, it wasn't Iran was officially one of the axis of evil, right?
Yeah,
Baby Bush.
it was. I'd like to know what Iran has done to hurt the interests of you or me or any other American ever. I can't think of anything offhand.
Well,
I mean,
well, you could.
I can't think of it.
I mean, the people who were in their territory, you know, when they during the coup there, I guess the Americans, you know, were at least held hostage during the time period. But again, they were in their country and they were defying their laws. So.
Well, exactly. Sure, a bunch of Iranian students chimped out, but those were U.S. government employees in a foreign country. Right. Okay, you take some risk. Okay, what since then?
Yep. I don't know, but I've heard they're dangerous. I think that's what matters.
Well, the next thing that I came up with reading this stupid article, Russia becomes a superpower to Iran. He says a country that is permanently estranged from the world. Well, as I mentioned before, Russia really isn't a country. It's a multicultural domestic empire. Now, in the land area that's called Russia today, most of the inhabitants are ethnic Russians. Okay, right, that's fine. But there are scores, hundreds of other ethnic groups in other autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. Those are technical terms that they use for different oblasts that they have there. So it's really like increasingly like the US. It's a multicultural domestic empire. It's not really a country. Now, if the Russians spin off, as they should, Chechnya and other places like that don't want to be part of Russia anymore, well, it could become a very big country. But right now, it's a multicultural domestic empire. It's not a country. So he uses that word. It doesn't really define it, which as a wonk writing a public, what do you call this?
An opinion piece here.
An opinion piece. I think he should be much, much, much more careful in the way he uses words.
Well, it also, in this line also, it talks about it's dangerous, that Russia is more dangerous because they are permanently estranged from the world. Now, why is that happening? It's happening because of the escalation by the West, though, that they're permanently estranged. Like, they don't have to be permanently estranged. It's just because they're not, they're making decisions independently Putin regime is making decisions that are independently, they think, good for the Putin regime and not what the liberal order of the West really wants them to do. Then they're cutting them off from everything, including stealing their central bank reserves. It's their fault that there's permanent estrangement.
Right. I mean, listen, it's a major criminal theft to take the central bank reserves of Russia and confiscate them, basically steal them, and expect to get away with it, like that's the right thing to do. This kind of reminds me to something we mentioned a few moments ago. It's that I think it was Thomas Friedman that writes these books about the world is flat, and I think it was him that said that no countries have ever gone to war if they've each had McDonald's franchises. Well, McDonald's has closed down its franchises. I guess that's a step towards war.
That's a good point. I guess the world might not be flat after all. Globalism might not be the answer to everything, at least not in the way it's been done.
So, okay. Another thing I got here is his, what should we do about it? He's got two important points. First, Washington needs to start thinking seriously about Russia's long-term trajectory. Well, of course, everybody's thinking about that. Everybody's wondering, but it's like he's really asking in a subtle way, well, what are we going to do about it? I mean, how should we intervene?
Yeah, well, but also he's also making it, letting people know that they probably need to hire, some people that are really good at thinking, that specialize in thinking, maybe consult with some think tanks to help them more seriously think about the future.
That's right. That's right. Obviously, he needs a gigantic government contract to come out with more blather like this. And then the next paragraph, he goes on, the U.S. and its allies are rightly using devastating sanctions like stealing their reserves. This guy has absolutely no common sense, no moral compass, no grasp of even recent history, forget about longer history. But somehow, like so many of these people in Washington, D.C., he's somehow gotten himself into the halls of power. And, Bloomberg publishes this, and, people take it as gospel. And
well, Doug, even this guy's he's for the Henry Kissinger, school of whatever, from Johns Hopkins. But this seems like this is like, and I don't like Kissinger at all. I don't like him at all. But this does not seem like this seems so childish, the heavy-handed approach, that the way the U.S. has handled this, that I can't imagine Kissinger would be accepted. He would just seemingly understand that if you're given your opponent no escape in the way that they've handled it. I mean, don't you think Kissinger would be totally against this approach?
Oh, I agree. And as evil as Kissinger is, he's not stupid. And I think he'd recognize that when you provoke any person or country enough, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah.
And, when you're talking about the prospect of nuclear war and cyber war and bio war, which it appears that the US was contemplating with these bio labs in the Ukraine, yeah, you're playing for high stakes here.
But I like the way this guy frames it. He says, we have to impose these heavy costs. And he says the only obvious alternatives are appeasement and military intervention, which are both abhorrent alternatives. So there's no other choice. This be the way we're handling it. It has to be the right way, or else it's war or appeasement.
You're right. It's just so stupid. Those are our choices: appeasement or military intervention. I mean, we're dealing with the moron here, and so anyway. But
do you think he's that? Do you think he's this stupid, or he just thinks that his readers are this stupid?
Well, both, and he'd be right in both ways. Shamefully, I was sent this article by a friend of mine in Aspen, who's a very, very successful oil guy. And like most oil guys, he's kind of right wing and reflexive that way. But I didn't seek this article out. It was a friend of mine sent it to me, apparently because he thought it was a good article. So he thought
it was making a compelling case for what would happen next.
I know. So the answer to the question is, the author is stupid, and the people he's writing for are, well, my friend's not stupid, but perhaps not as thoughtful as he might be in this case. I'll put it that way, just in case he's listening.
All right. Well, so what's the big takeaway from this article then? Do you think this is the line of thinking of the DC establishment generally?
No question about it. The credentials that are given earlier on, the fact this guy's written a lot of books and so forth, I'm sure he goes to the right parties and knows all the right pals. Absolutely. This is the way people within the Beltway think.
The thing that is most disturbing to me about all of this, even more disturbing than just how childishly simple he boils the points down to, is that there's no serious recognition of the risks that we face, that Americans face, as with everything that's happening right now and how things could unwind from here. It just seems to be like it's all academic,
Yes. And I like the way that this moron uses the term we should do this, we should do that. Hey, what do you mean? What do you mean? Hey, what do you mean we? I don't want to be included in this we. It's
Right.
like,
And neither will he be included in that we if it involves any conflict or hardship. That's the thing.
no, he won't. No, he'll be safe in his bunker in D.C.
Yeah.
Oh, God, situation is hopeless.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping to get John Robb on later this week, so we can talk to him about his point of view. John is not a statist, although he is comes from, or he was in the Air Force for a while, and he has certainly advised the Defense Department on various things, and he has a very strategic mind and understands war and all of this. But I'm hoping we can get him on because he has a much more sober view of the risks that the U.S. and the Western powers face right now in this confrontation with Russia.
Well, perhaps we can talk to him this Wednesday. And I like John a lot because he's a I hate to say out of the box because
Oh, but he is.
he's an unconventional thinker, and he's got very well thought out opinions on, especially on military matters.
Yep. There's at least 3 times in the decade, 15 years or whatever that I know John, where he has given me completely new and totally different way of viewing reality. Like totally something I had not considered at all, something that was not, through my linear thinking and my education, never would have realized on my own. So he is definitely an out of the box thinker, very unique in that way. So yeah, hopefully we can get him on Wednesday and we'll see what he has to say from there. Doug, anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up for today?
I think we're good, Matt.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right.